You do need to know, folks, and that's why you're listening to the Gazette Radio Hour with Doug and John. Chris Burke filling in for John this week on your hometown station, AM-1220 KHTS. We're talking to Christine Herman, who is the author of the book, Because It Didn't Kill Me. It's a great book, folks. You got to get it. How she overcame adversity in her life. And one of the first adversities you faced, Christine, which I forgot to bring up in the first segment, was before you were even born. Is that right?
Yes.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Well, when I was conceived, I have an older brother, and apparently when I was conceived, I had a different blood type than my mom. So her body developed antibodies to fight off this intrusion. And when I was born, I had what was called erythroblastosis, meaning the mother's blood is different from the infant's blood. So the mother's blood tries to kill the infant's blood. And half an hour after I was born, I turned like a bright mustard yellow, which is called kernicterus. I was diagnosed with that, kernicterus, which is, at that point, brain death in an infant. And unless it's reversed, the kernicterus, unless it's stopped or reversed, the baby suffers, brain death and can die from it. Well, as it turned out, my pediatrician or her pediatrician or obstetrician neither were in town that day. So my dad called the doctor that my mom worked for, who made arrangements to get me to one of the hospitals that could deal with this situation. The only hospitals that were available to deal with it were Cedars of Sinai, which was then Cedars Lebanon, and Children's Hospital. But both hospitals did not have any available beds in the pediatric ward. So arrangements were made by the doctor my mom worked for. They got me a bed in Cedars, but they couldn't get me to the hospital because back in 1969, an RN had to accompany the infant in the incubator. So it took 3 hours for them to find an RN. Well, I was finally transferred to Cedars and given blood transfusion by Dr. Gary Berry and his team, and so that saved my life there. And then my parents were able to take me home on Christmas Eve, but I had to go back for more transfusions because I was having blood difficulties with anemia. And then they did more transfusions after that. And then I had to go back in the hospital because I developed septic shock from the bone marrow study that was done. So I almost died from that. And then I went in for more transfusions. And finally, I was done with that. So I spent the first 60 days of my life, I spent 30 in the hospital.
Okay, so let's fast forward to almost 13 years later, right, 1982. Mm-hmm. You're playing with your friends in the neighborhood. You run out in the driveway. You get hit by a car. You're thrown 46 feet. You're in intensive care, and I assume they thought you might have a chance of dying.
Yeah.
And so you're in Henry Mayo, correct?
Mm-hmm.
And what do you remember from being in Henry Mayo in your recovery process?
You know what? Not one thing. Wow. Not one thing at all. In the book, in the notes, the copies of the notes that I wrote with my family, my brother asked me if I remembered the rotating bed, and I said I did. To this day, I have no recollection of it.
Okay. So what is your first recollection then after recovery and going back to school?
My first recollection is being in a wheelchair, shopping in the UCLA gift store with my mom before we made our trip to Northridge Hospital for my rehabilitation.
So they had transferred you from Henry Mayo to UCLA?
They did, yes.
And then to Northridge Hospital.
I'm sorry?
And then to Northridge Hospital. That was the third. That was the third hospital, correct?
Yeah. Henry Mayo was the first. Then I went to UCLA because they were better equipped for my recovery, and then it was Northridge Hospital for rehabilitation.
Okay. And then unfortunately, we're coming up on the break again. But let's fast forward. You graduate on time from high school?
I graduated on time from junior high school, yeah.
And then it's off to college.
I went off to college.
Now, I want to talk about this after the break more, Christine, but I love the book as well, and I also couldn't put it down. And I want to talk more about, you keep mentioning the term emotional development, yet you had so many jobs for such a long time, and you kept those jobs. And it seems like the emotional development was more on your end than anybody else. Is that true?
Right.
That people didn't it didn't come up from the other side as much as it came into your life?
Right.
Okay, let's talk about it a little more when we get back.
Okay, sounds good.
All right, everybody, we're talking to Christine Herman, who is the author of the book Because It Didn't Kill Me. And like I said, if you have a copy of the Gazette with you, or you want to pick one up real quick, it's on page 14. We have an article, well-written article about Christine and her situation, and the book, like I said, on page 14 of the Gazette. And you are listening to the Gazette Radio Hour on AM-1220 KHTS, your hometown station. We'll be right back. We're back, everybody, on Santa Clarita's hometown station, AM-1220 KHTS. It's the Gazette Radio Hour with Doug and John, with Chris Burke filling in for John. All you need to know to be in the know, the Radio Digest version of the Gazette. We're talking to Christine Herman, author of the book Because It Didn't Kill Me.
Christine, 15 years you were a teacher, correct?
Yes.
So you mentioned in the book that you weren't aware, and you mentioned this a few different times, you weren't aware that you had inabilities. When you say that, what do you mean, inabilities, and was anybody else aware, unless you told them?
Well, the inabilities I'm talking about are like relating with people, acting my age, because when I finally realized that I was missing all these years, I was approximately 40 years old. And, most people like to be social and hang out with their peers and do things with their peers. And I noticed that I didn't have a lot of social interactions. And when I would ride the train to and from work, I noticed that the people on the train would not so much give me or say things to me, but it was the way they looked at me, the way they responded to me. And in the habit of analyzing everything in my life so I could recover and become who I felt was a grown, mature adult, I analyzed how people reacted to me. And I began to see that, I'm acting in a very immature way. And actually, I had a huge turning point. It was one day I was driving down the 405 freeway. I was right by Devonshire, and I had this realization that 27 years of my life had been taken from me. And I was in awe. I was shocked, and I was angry that God would allow 27 years to be taken away from me. But it was then that I realized from the accident, I had the 13 years wiped out when my forehead hit the street. But then it was the next 13 or 14 years was recovering that. And it was, because when I was 13 years old and I went back to school, after the car accident, the 13 years had been wiped out. Like I said, when my forehead hit the street, I didn't know, nobody knew, the doctors didn't know. It was just a traumatic brain injury can be compared to a kaleidoscope. When you hit one area of the brain, so many areas are affected. And, those things that were affected are things that are developed in a baby, in a child. Just as you develop, like when you're crawling on the floor playing with your toys, you are developing emotional capabilities then, and you don't even realize it. That's just the normal formation of babies and infants and toddlers into childhood and teenage years and young adulthood. And I realized it, though, that one day on the freeway, and I made a promise to myself that I would become the person that God meant me to be. And it would take a lot of work, because a lot of the behaviors that I had grown accustomed to using, even though they were 13 years behind, seemed normal to me because I had no way to compare it.
So when I read this book, I feel like I'm reading a tremendous success story.
Uh-huh.
And I don't know if that was the moment you decided to write the book, and I'm also curious as to at what point did you, as a Christian, rely on God to help you through this? And did that come early in the recovery process, or more or later as you're discovering exactly what exactly happened to you?
Well, what happened was I went to San Diego to go to school to get my teaching credential. And while I was in San Diego, I was attending a church called Horizon Christian Fellowship. And there was a gentleman whose daughter had been hit by a car. And it hit my heart that, oh my gosh, I didn't know how bad it was, but I knew that this young child would have, a difficult road ahead of her. And I wished at that point I had a book to write to share with the gentleman to at least give him some comfort. And, and I could relate to that, but I didn't know I had any inabilities or any insufficiencies in my behavior. But then once I realized I was 27 years behind, I began to look back at how I had acted in certain situations, and I could pinpoint, okay, the accident happened when I was 13 years old, and I am acting as somebody 13 years younger. And I don't know if it was just a realization or something that God put in my heart. I don't know, but it was like an eye opener, and I vowed to become the person that I was meant to be. And as far as, when did I include my God in this walk? Well, I was raised in a Christian home, and I always relied on my faith in God. And I really began to rely on that faith when life got difficult, when my friends are getting married and they're going off and they're pursuing their careers, and I'm still struggling to develop interpersonal relationships. I'm still struggling to organize material for teaching. I'm still struggling to do things that people do second nature. And I never understood why I struggled so hard. When I was in student teaching, before I got my credential, my master teacher commented to her teaching partner that I spent a lot of time on organization and planning. And I didn't think it was any big deal. I just thought, I'm, new to the teaching career and I need to spend longer to plan. But it's always been that way for me since the accident. And I've realized with the research I've done that when you have a traumatic brain injury, things take a little bit longer to accomplish until you learn them and they become second nature. But a lot of times with teaching, you've got the different student achievement levels, and you have to specialize instruction, and that has to be organized. Or when you teach your lessons, you have to organize what you're going to say to the students. And that was all very difficult in learning how to do, because what came second nature to my student teaching buddy was very difficult for me at times.
So at this point, you do what everybody in your situation does, and you go on the love connection.
Did you really, Christine?
Well, I actually went on that because I wanted to be on TV. I had always watched that show since I was about 13 years old, and I wanted to be on that show. I wanted to be on TV. And for some reason, in the back of my mind, I've always wanted my story to be known. And I wanted to be on TV. I wanted to be seen. I wanted to be a success. And I thought maybe this is how I can be a success. If I can get out there and I can show my personality and who I am and how full of life I am, maybe something will turn from this. And it was a neat experience, but it's kind of funny.
Christine, I have to tell you, because we're almost out of time, but from my interaction with you, seeing you where you work, and then seeing you again at church, I did not know your situation or your story. And what you're speaking of about your social interaction skills seemed perfectly fine to me.
Uh-huh.
And if you never would have told me about your accident, I don't think I would have ever known anything, that you were just still a very intelligent, nice young lady. So I want to give you credit for that. And I also want to say it's a great book, and if people need some inspiration on how to overcome adversity. I mean, oh my goodness, Christine Herman has overcame a ton of adversity, and if you need some inspiration on your life, and maybe you haven't got as bad as she had it, and what she's overcome, I really encourage you to read this book.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Christine, it's Christine Herman we've been talking to, folks. She wrote the book Because It Didn't Kill Me. Christine, where can people get the book?
You can get the book off Amazon.com. You can type in my name, or when you go to the book selection, to type in the title of the book, or you can visit CreateSpace. It's https www.createspace.com/5388535. That's how you order from CreateSpace, or I sell the books to you personally. And when I sell the books to you personally, I will sign them.
Cool. And also, folks, if you look at the article in the Gazette I was speaking about,
it was an excellent article.
It's got the address there, too.
Thank you so much, Christine.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, bye-bye. All right, everybody, it's the Gazette Radio Hour on Hometown Station, AM-1220 KHTS. We'll be right back.